The morning of March 3, 1944, emerged across the European theatre with the peculiar clarity that often precedes moments of historical consequence. At 0547 hours, ground crews at RAF Honington in Suffolk began their methodical preparation of aircraft that would, within hours, participate in one of the most unconventional aerial engagements of the Second World War. The air temperature registered 38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to require careful attention to engine preheating procedures, yet sufficiently moderate to permit full operational capability of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters scheduled for that day's mission. Lieutenant Arthur Budd, Haydn of the 55th Fighter Squadron, 20th Fighter Group, conducted his pre-flight inspection with the systematic precision that had become reflexive after 127 combat hours over occupied Europe. The P-38J-15LO he would fly that day, serial number 42104024, marked with the Squadron Identification LCT, represented the culmination of nearly 3 years of iterative design refinement since the Lightning's operational introduction in 1941. Standing before this aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness, Haydn embodied the statistical improbability of survival that characterized extended combat operations. Of the original pilots who had deployed with the 20th Fighter Group to England in August 1943, fewer than 40% remained on active duty status 7 months later. The P-38 Lightning itself presented a technological paradox that would prove central to the events that followed. Conceived during a period when conventional fighter design philosophy emphasized single-engine configurations, the Lightning's twin-boom architecture, each housing a supercharged Allison V1710 engine generating 1425 horsepower, created both extraordinary capabilities and unique vulnerabilities. The aircraft's tricycle landing gear, revolutionary at the time of its introduction, permitted higher angles of attack during takeoff and improved pilot visibility during ground operations. Its centrally mounted armament cluster, 120mm Hispano autocannon and 4.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, eliminated the convergence issues that plagued wing-mounted weapons systems, creating a concentrated cone of fire that proved devastatingly effective when properly employed. Yet, this same design philosophy generated acoustic and visual signatures that experienced Luftwaffe pilots had learned to identify from distances exceeding 2 miles under favorable atmospheric conditions. The distinctive sound of counter-rotating propellers, a design feature intended to eliminate the torque effects that complicated single-engine fighter operations, created a characteristic frequency pattern that enemy pilots described as resembling a mechanical growl. German fighter tactics, documented in captured Luftwaffe training materials and post-war intelligence assessments, specifically addressed engagement protocols for the P-38, reflecting both respect for its capabilities and recognition of exploitable characteristics. The pre-dawn ritual of aircraft preparation involved more than mechanical inspection. It represented a psychological transition from the relative safety of ground operations to the three-dimensional combat environment, where survival depended on instantaneous decision-making, technical proficiency, and an element of chance that no amount of skill could fully eliminate. Haydn moved through this ritual with practiced efficiency, checking control surface movement, examining propeller blades for damage or ice accumulation, verifying ammunition loads, testing radio equipment, and conducting the elaborate engine start sequence that the P-38's twin power plants required. Each action in this sequence represented accumulated wisdom from thousands of hours of operational experience, distilled into procedures that maximized reliability while minimizing the risk of mechanical failure during critical mission phases. The briefing room at 615 hours contained 42 pilots from the 20th Fighter Group, men ranging in age from 19 to 28, representing diverse backgrounds from across the United States. Some had been college students when Pearl Harbor transformed their lives, others had worked in factories or on farms, and a few had already been in military service when the war began. What unified them was the intensive training that had transformed civilian backgrounds into combat-ready aviators, and the shared experience of surviving missions where statistical probability suggested they should have died. The atmosphere in briefing rooms before major missions carried a distinctive character, a combination of professional focus, suppressed anxiety, and the dark humor that combat personnel universally employ as psychological defense against the reality of what they are about to undertake. The intelligence officer, a Major Peterson who had never flown combat but whose analytical capabilities were respected by the pilots, outlined the mission parameters with methodical precision. The target for the day was an industrial complex near Brunswick, approximately 380 miles from the English coast, producing components for German aircraft manufacture. Intelligence estimates suggested the facility employed over 3,000 workers and contributed significantly to Luftwaffe production capacity. The strategic bombing campaign's objective involved not merely destroying individual facilities, but systematically degrading Germany's capacity to sustain military operations through cumulative destruction of industrial infrastructure, transportation networks, and resource production. The bomber force would consist of 184 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers from 3 bombardment groups, carrying a total payload exceeding 450 tons of high explosive and incendiary ordnance. The B-17s would assemble over England in a formation that stretched across 15 miles of sky, maintaining altitudes between 24,000 and 26,000 feet throughout the penetration phase. Fighter escort would be provided by multiple groups flying P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and the increasingly prevalent P-51 Mustangs, with different groups assuming escort responsibility at various phases of the mission based on their respective fuel endurance characteristics and operational positioning. Expected opposition included substantial Luftwaffe fighter forces estimated at 150 to 200 aircraft from various Jagdgeschwader based throughout northwestern Germany and the occupied Netherlands. Intelligence assessments indicated these forces would likely employ evolved tactical doctrine emphasizing coordinated attacks from multiple vectors, designed to overwhelm escort fighter coverage at specific points in the bomber stream. German pilots, while increasingly including inexperienced replacements due to sustained attrition, still numbered sufficient veterans with extensive combat experience to pose serious threats to both bomber and escort formations. Lieutenant Hayden's assigned position placed him in the high cover element, operating approximately 3,000 feet above the bomber formation. This positioning reflected tactical doctrine derived from careful analysis of engagement patterns over the preceding 18 months. German fighters typically initiated attacks from altitude advantages, diving through bomber formations to maximize velocity and minimize exposure to defensive fire. High-cover fighters, positioned to intercept these diving attacks, faced the perpetual challenge of maintaining sufficient energy advantage while remaining geometrically capable of engaging enemy aircraft before they reached the bombers. The mathematics of this positioning involved continuous calculation of relative energy states, closure rates, and geometric relationships between multiple moving elements in three-dimensional space. The weather forecast predicted generally favorable conditions with scattered clouds at various altitudes and visibility exceeding 10 miles throughout most of the mission route. This represented both advantage and challenge. Good visibility enhanced navigation accuracy and target identification, but also provided German fighters with optimal conditions for visual acquisition of bomber formations. The scattered clouds could provide tactical concealment opportunities for both attacking and defending aircraft, creating ambush possibilities that demanded constant vigilance from escort pilots. To understand the events that would unfold required understanding the transformation that created combat pilots like Arthur Hayden. His journey from civilian life to the cockpit of a frontline fighter aircraft represented an intensive industrial-scale training process that the United States Army Air Forces had developed to transform thousands of young men into combat aviators within compressed timeframes. Hayden had been born in 1921 in rural Pennsylvania, the second son of a family that operated a small manufacturing business producing agricultural equipment. His early life provided no particular indication of future military aviation service. He had never flown in an aircraft before his enlistment in June 1942. The decision to join the Army Air Forces, rather than pursue ground service or naval aviation, reflected a combination of personal inclination toward mechanical systems, the cultural prestige associated with aviation service, and the practical calculation that pilot survival rates, while severe, compared favorably to infantry service in terms of controllable risk factors. The recruitment materials emphasized the technical nature of aviation service, the rigorous selection process that accepted only the most qualified candidates, and the sophisticated training that would transform civilians into military aviators. These materials carefully balanced the appeal of aviation service against the implicit acknowledgement of its dangers, creating narratives that emphasize capability and professionalism rather than adventure or glory. The training pipeline Hayden entered in summer 1942 represented one of the most ambitious Aviation training programs and history. The Army Air Forces faced the challenge of expanding from approximately 26,500 personnel in 1939 to over 2.4 million by 1944, with pilot requirements growing proportionally. This expansion necessitated creation of a standardized training system capable of producing pilots with consistent skill levels while maintaining acceptable safety standards during training operations. The training facilities themselves represented massive infrastructure investments, with dozens of new airfields constructed specifically for training purposes, equipped with classrooms, simulators, maintenance facilities, and the administrative apparatus required to process thousands of students through standardized curricula. Haydn's progression through this system began with classification and pre-flight training from June through August 1942, 9 weeks at Santa Ana Army Air Base in California, involving academic instruction in mathematics, physics, navigation, meteorology, and aircraft recognition. The curriculum also included physical conditioning, military discipline, and psychological assessment designed to identify candidates unsuitable for aviation service. The academic components were demanding, requiring mastery of mathematical concepts many students had never encountered in civilian education. Navigation instruction involved spherical trigonometry, celestial navigation principles, and dead reckoning calculations. Meteorology covered atmospheric physics, weather pattern recognition, and the relationship between meteorological conditions and flight operations. Aircraft recognition training developed the ability to identify friendly and enemy aircraft from brief glimpses at various angles and distances, a skill that could mean the difference between life and death in combat conditions. Approximately 23% of candidates washed out during this phase, typically due to academic deficiencies, motion sickness discovered during orientation flights, or psychological factors that assessment officers determined made them unsuitable for the stress of combat aviation. The selection process, while designed to be fair and objective, inevitably involved subjective judgments by instructors and assessment officers who bore responsibility for certifying students as capable of progressing to flight training. The psychological burden of these decisions weighed on training personnel who understood that passing marginal students might result in fatal accidents during training or combat failures that could cost lives beyond just the inadequately prepared pilot. Primary flight training followed from September through November 1942, 10 weeks at Thunderbird Field in Arizona flying PT-17 Stearman biplanes. This phase introduced basic flying skills, including takeoffs, landings, straight and level flight, turns, climbs, descents, and elementary aerobatics. The training emphasized development of kinesthetic awareness and muscle memory necessary for aircraft control, the ability to maintain spatial orientation during maneuvering, and the coordination required to manage multiple controls simultaneously while processing visual information and maintaining situational awareness. Instructors evaluated students on coordination, judgment, and ability to manage task saturation, the condition where the number of required tasks exceeds the pilot's capacity to perform them all adequately. Solo flight, that transformative moment when students first operated an aircraft without instructor supervision, occurred after approximately 8 to 12 hours of dual instruction. The experience represented a psychological threshold, confirmation that the student had developed sufficient skill to manage an aircraft independently. Yet it also represented the point where training became genuinely dangerous, where student errors could result in fatal accidents rather than instructional interventions by the supervising instructor. Washout rates during primary training averaged 18%, with most failures attributable to inability to develop adequate flying skills within the prescribed time frame. The training schedule's compressed nature meant students who might eventually have succeeded with additional instruction were eliminated because wartime necessity demanded rapid throughput rather than universal success. Basic flight training from December 1942 through February 1943 involved 9 weeks at Marana Army Airfield in Arizona flying BT-13 Valiant trainers. More powerful and complex aircraft requiring greater precision and introducing instrument flying, night operations and formation procedures. The BT-13, nicknamed the Vultee vibrator due to its tendency to shake at certain power settings, possessed handling characteristics substantially different from the forgiving Stearman. It featured retractable landing gear, variable pitch propeller, and flight characteristics that punished inattention or improper technique more severely than primary trainers. Students learned to manage more complex engine controls, navigate using instruments when visual references were obscured, maintain formation positions relative to other aircraft, and operate at night when visual cues were dramatically reduced. The transition to instrument flight represented a particularly challenging phase. Human sensory systems evolved for ground-based existence provide misleading information during flight, particularly in conditions where visual references are limited. The vestibular system, which provides balance and spatial orientation information on the ground, generates false sensations during flight that can create powerful illusions of aircraft attitude contrary to actual flight conditions. Pilots experiencing spatial disorientation often become convinced the aircraft is in one attitude, while instruments indicate something entirely different. Learning to trust instruments over sensory perception requires overcoming deeply ingrained survival instincts, a psychological adaptation that some students never successfully achieved. Approximately 15% of students washed out during basic training, many due to inability to master instrument flight or night operations. Advanced flight training from March through May 1943 lasted 10 weeks at Luke Field in Arizona, flying 86 Texan trainers that approximated the performance and handling characteristics of frontline fighters. This phase introduced aerial gunnery, dive bombing, tactical formation flying, and simulated combat maneuvers. Students flew multiple training missions daily, accumulating approximately 70 hours of advanced flight time. The training emphasized combat-relevant skills including accurate gunnery against aerial and ground targets, aggressive maneuvering at the edges of aircraft performance envelopes, formation discipline under simulated combat conditions, and combat decision-making under time pressure. Aerial gunnery involved firing at towed targets, while managing the complex calculations required to ensure rounds intercepted the target considering relative motion, bullet trajectory, and deflection angles. Fighter transition training followed from June through August 1943, where pilots learned to operate the specific aircraft types they would fly in combat. Hayden's assignment to P-38 training reflected the aircraft's complexity and the need for specialized instruction beyond the general fighter training provided in advanced phases. P-38 transition training lasted approximately 6 weeks and emphasized the unique characteristics of twin-engine fighter operation. Students learned to manage asymmetric thrust during single-engine situations, where loss of one engine created powerful yawing moments that could result in uncontrollable rolls if not properly countered. They practiced complex engine management with separate controls for each power plant, each requiring continuous monitoring and adjustment. High-altitude operations were extensively covered, including the physiological effects of reduced atmospheric pressure, operation of oxygen systems, and the pressure-breathing techniques required for operations above 30,000 feet. Throughout this training progression, which consumed nearly 14 months, Hayden accumulated approximately 325 flight hours. This represented a substantial foundation but remained modest compared to the 2,000-plus hours typical of experienced airline pilots or the flight time veteran Luftwaffe pilots had accumulated during the early war years. The compressed training timeline reflected wartime necessity. The need to produce combat-ready pilots rapidly exceeded the ideal of providing extensive training. This created a fundamental tension throughout the training program, balancing thoroughness against urgency, depth against breadth, safety against production requirements. Training casualties were substantial, with approximately 15,000 Army Air Forces personnel dying in training accidents during the war, a sobering statistic that underscored the inherent dangers of learning to operate high-performance aircraft within compressed timeframes. The psychological transformation accompanying this technical training proved equally significant. Hayden and his fellow trainees underwent a process of identity reformation, transitioning from civilians to military aviators with distinct professional identity, specialized skills, and acceptance of extraordinary risks as routine aspects of their duties. This transformation involved adoption of military discipline, internalization of organizational values, development of confidence in personal capabilities, and acceptance of combat service as inevitable rather than hypothetical. The training environment deliberately cultivated these psychological adaptations through structured experiences designed to build confidence while maintaining realistic awareness of aviation's dangers. The mission briefing for March 3rd reflected the evolved understanding of strategic bombing doctrine that had emerged through brutal experience during the winter of 1943-1944. Major operations planners at WWII Fighter Command Headquarters had calculated attrition rates with actuarial precision. Unescorted bomber formations penetrating beyond 250 miles into German-controlled airspace sustained loss rates averaging 9.2% per mission. When projected across multiple operations, this figure guaranteed the complete destruction of bomber groups within mathematically predictable timeframes. A bomber group flying 30 missions at 9% loss rate would, statistically, lose all its aircraft, requiring complete replacement of both aircraft and trained crews. This statistical reality had forced fundamental reassessment of strategic bombing theory. The doctrine that had guided pre-war planning, that heavily armed bomber formations could defend themselves against fighter interception through concentrated defensive firepower, had proven inadequate when confronted with operational reality over Europe. The Boeing B-17's designation as Flying Fortress reflected doctrinal confidence that proved misplaced. German fighter pilots had developed tactics specifically designed to negate bomber defensive advantages. High-speed frontal attacks minimized exposure time to defensive fire, exploiting the fact that bomber forward-firing defensive capability was limited. Coordinated attacks from multiple vectors overwhelmed defensive fire concentration, forcing gunners to split attention among multiple threats. Exploitation of defensive blind spots, where turret coverage overlapped inadequately, provided attack vectors with reduced exposure to defensive fire. The development of long-range fighter escort capability represented the operational solution to this tactical crisis. However, this solution required overcoming substantial technical challenges. Fighter aircraft, optimized for performance characteristics including speed, maneuverability, and rate of climb, traditionally sacrificed range for these attributes. The design physics were unforgiving. Each pound of fuel carried represented weight that could otherwise provide structural strength, armament, or performance capability. Extending fighter operational radius to match bomber penetration depths required either accepting performance compromises or developing entirely new aircraft designs incorporating advanced technologies that might offset the weight penalties of additional fuel capacity. The P-38 Lightning represented an early attempt to address these requirements through twin-engine configuration. The additional fuel capacity permitted by two engines, combined with external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned when combat required maximum performance, enabled escort missions to ranges approaching 400 miles. However, the P-38's introduction to European combat operations had revealed unexpected challenges. The aircraft's liquid-cooled engines proved vulnerable to battle damage. A single projectile penetrating a coolant line could cause rapid engine temperature escalation, requiring shutdown, transforming a twin-engine fighter into a single-engine aircraft with marginal performance. The extreme cold of high-altitude operations over Europe caused engine cooling issues paradoxically opposite to overheating, with oil congealing and reducing lubrication effectiveness. The aircraft's distinctive appearance made visual identification by enemy forces instantaneous. Unlike single-engine fighters that shared broadly similar silhouettes, the P-38's twin-boom configuration was unmistakable. This eliminated any possibility of momentary confusion that might delay enemy recognition. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots had learned to identify P-38s from their distinctive engine sound before visual contact occurred. The counter-rotating propellers created an acoustic signature unlike any other aircraft, a mechanical growl that carried for miles under favorable atmospheric conditions. German pilots' memoirs and post-war interviews frequently mentioned this characteristic sound as providing early warning of P-38 presence. Performance characteristics, while impressive in specific flight regimes, proved inferior to German fighters in certain tactical situations. The P-38's turning radius at combat speeds exceeded that of single-engine fighters, disadvantaging it in horizontal turning engagements. Its roll rate, particularly in early variants, was inferior to that of Bf-109 and FW-190 aircraft. In high-speed dives, the P-38 encountered compressibility effects, aerodynamic phenomena where air flowing over the wing approached the speed of sound, creating shock waves that altered control surface effectiveness. Pilots caught in these situations found controls becoming increasingly heavy and unresponsive, sometimes resulting in uncontrollable descents that ended in structural failure or ground impact. The North American P-51 Mustang, equipped with the British-designed Merlin engine and incorporating innovative fuel system design, eventually emerged as the definitive escort fighter. It combined performance, range, and reliability in proportions superior to any other contemporary fighter. The Mustang's design incorporated lessons learned from early war combat, aerodynamic refinement that reduced drag, and systems integration that maximized performance within available technology. However, in March 1944, P-51 deployment remained incomplete. Production had ramped up substantially, but not yet to levels sufficient to replace P-38 and P-47 squadrons entirely. P-38 and Republic P-47 Thunderbolt squadrons consequently carried substantial escort responsibilities during this transitional period. The mission proceeded with methodical precision during its first hour. Takeoff operations began at 0710 hours, with aircraft departing at 45-second intervals, forming up into flights of 4 aircraft over the English countryside before assuming their assigned positions relative to the bomber stream. Radio discipline remained strict, with communication limited to essential position reports and threat warnings. Unnecessary radio traffic could mask critical communications, interfere with navigation transmissions, or provide German radio direction finding equipment with signals to track. Pilots maintained formation through visual reference to other aircraft, constantly adjusting throttle, trim, and flight path to hold assigned positions within the fluid geometry of formation flight. The bomber stream stretched across approximately 15 miles of sky, a formation density calculated to optimize defensive crossfire capability while minimizing collision risk and maximizing navigational flexibility. Each bombardment group maintained internal cohesion while positioned relative to other groups in ways that permitted mutual support without creating excessive density that would complicate maneuvering. Fighter escorts weaved in complex patterns above and beside the bombers, trading altitude for airspeed and back again in the endless energy management equation that governs survival in three-dimensional combat. This weaving motion, while consuming additional fuel and requiring continuous pilot attention, prevented escort fighters from becoming predictable targets and maintained their energy state sufficient to engage threats effectively. The English Channel crossing occurred at 0753 hours with the formation maintaining 24,000 feet and proceeding at indicated airspeed of 165 miles per hour. The bomber's relatively slow cruise speed, dictated by the need to maintain formation integrity and optimize fuel consumption for the extended mission profile, created tactical vulnerabilities that escort fighters existed to mitigate. At these speeds, bomber formations were vulnerable to faster enemy fighters that could choose engagement timing and attack vectors. The geometric reality of interception meant that German fighters operating at higher speeds could execute hit-and-run attacks, diving through formations and disengaging before escort fighters could effectively respond. Continental landfall occurred at 0808 hours near the Dutch coast, marking transition from relatively safe airspace over the Channel to hostile territory where German radar networks tracked the formation's progress and ground controllers vectored fighter forces toward intercept positions. The psychological transition accompanying this geographic boundary was palpable. Over the Channel, the primary threats were mechanical failure, navigation errors, or weather. Over occupied Europe, these threats persisted, but were overshadowed by enemy action. Every minute of flight represented potential contact with enemy fighters or anti-aircraft fire. The radar warning receivers installed in some aircraft occasionally detected search radar emissions, providing abstract electronic confirmation of the hostile attention focused on the formation. At 09:15 hours, approximately 40 miles southeast of Bremen, the radar operators aboard the lead B-17 detected the characteristic signatures of approaching aircraft. The contacts resolved into a formation of approximately 18 Messerschmitt Bf 109G fighters operating at 29,000 feet and converging on an intercept vector calculated to position them ahead and above the bomber formation. The Bf 109G represented the technological maturation of a design concept that had first entered service in 1937. By 1944, the Gustav variant incorporated a Daimler-Benz DB605A engine producing 1,475 horsepower, enabling performance characteristics that, under specific conditions, exceeded those of Allied escort fighters. The Bf 109's development history paralleled the war's trajectory. Early variants had established German air superiority during the Spanish Civil War and the early campaigns in Poland and France. Subsequent variants incorporated progressive improvements in engine power, armament, and systems as combat experience revealed deficiencies and enemy capabilities evolved. By the Gustav variant, the aircraft represented a design pushed to its developmental limits, extracting maximum performance from an airframe that had originated in 1935. The result was an aircraft with excellent rate of climb, good high-altitude performance and adequate armament, but also increasingly demanding handling characteristics. that challenged inexperienced pilots. The approaching German formation demonstrated evolved tactics reflecting lessons learned through costly experience. Their altitude advantage, approximately 1,000 feet above Haydn's high cover position, provided potential energy that could be converted to kinetic energy during diving attacks. Their positioning ahead of the bomber stream would permit high-speed head-on passes, the most tactically challenging attacks for bomber defensive gunners to counter. The relative closure rate in head-on attacks could exceed 600 miles per hour, providing gunners only seconds to acquire targets, calculate proper lead angles, and deliver effective fire before the attacking fighters flashed past and through the formation. Haydn's element, consisting of his aircraft and that of his wingman, Lieutenant James Cartwright, initiated their intercept sequence according to established protocols. This involved a climbing turn designed to convert their altitude advantage relative to the bombers into kinetic energy while positioning them between the German fighters and the bomber formation. The mathematics of interception required instantaneous mental calculation. Given the relative closure rate approaching 600 miles per hour combined, altitude differential of approximately 1,000 feet, and turn radius limitations of both aircraft types, Haydn needed to predict not where the enemy aircraft were, but where they would be when his flight path intersected theirs several seconds in the future. Physics of aerial interception involved complex, trigonometric relationships that pilots internalized through repetitive training until calculations occurred beneath conscious awareness. Two aircraft approaching each other at combined closure rates exceeding 600 miles per hour covered ground at approximately 880 feet per second. At typical visual acquisition range, approximately 2 miles or 10,560 feet under favorable conditions, pilots had roughly 12 seconds from initial visual contact to weapon firing range. During those seconds, both aircraft were maneuvering, changing the geometric relationships continuously. The attacking pilot needed to position his aircraft so that his weapon's ballistic trajectory would intersect the target aircraft's future position, accounting for bullet drop due to gravity, deflection required to compensate for relative lateral motion, and the continuous changes in relative positions as both aircraft maneuvered. Haydn's climbing turn represented optimal energy management for the tactical situation. By initiating the climb while turning, he converted some of his current airspeed into altitude, potential energy that could be reconverted to kinetic energy when needed. The P-38's excellent climb rate at high altitude, enabled by its turbocharged engines maintaining sea-level pressure to the engines despite the thin air at 28,000 feet, allowed him to gain altitude more rapidly than the German fighters could descend while maintaining formation integrity. This created a geometric advantage. Haydn would achieve firing position on the German formation's flank or rear quarter rather than confronting them head-on, where relative closure rates would minimize engagement time and reduce probability of achieving effective hits. The initial engagement unfolded with the violent brevity that characterized air combat. Haydn achieved firing position on the trailing Bf-109 in the German formation, closing to approximately 400 yards. This distance represented careful calculation balancing several factors. Closer ranges increased hit probability through reduced time of flight for projectiles and decreased angular error from deflection miscalculations, but also increased his exposure to return fire from other German aircraft and reduced available time to maneuver away from the target after firing. The computing gun sight mounted in Haydn's cockpit, a sophisticated electromechanical device representing cutting-edge fire control technology, automated some of the gunnery calculations. The pilot input target wingspan through a rotary dial. The sight then calculated required lead angle based on the target's apparent size, indicating range and rate of angular motion, indicating relative velocity. The technical sequence of aerial gunnery, practiced until it became reflexive through hundreds of practice engagements against towed targets, involved multiple simultaneous actions. The pilot needed to track the target smoothly, avoiding jerky motions that would throw off the sight's calculations. He adjusted the wingspan setting if the target type changed. He monitored the range closing rate to time his burst appropriately. He aligned the illuminated reticle with the target aircraft, while compensating for his own aircraft's motion. When all parameters aligned within acceptable tolerances, he depressed the trigger, initiating firing from all weapons simultaneously. Haydn's burst lasted 2.3 seconds, firing approximately 180 rounds from his 50 caliber weapons at a rate of 800 rounds per minute per gun, and 23 rounds from his 20 mm cannon cycling at 600 rounds per minute. The convergence of this fire pattern on the German fighter produced catastrophic results. Multiple rounds penetrated the Bf-109's coolant system. The Daimler-Benz DB605 engine, like all liquid-cooled designs, depended on continuous coolant circulation to dissipate the tremendous heat generated by combustion. Loss of coolant caused rapid temperature escalation. Within seconds, coolant temperature exceeded 120 degrees Celsius, approaching the point where aluminum engine components would begin thermal deformation. Additional strikes damaged the aircraft's tail structure and severed control cables. The Bf-109's control system used mechanical cables running from cockpit controls through the fuselage to control surface actuators. Severing these cables eliminated the pilot's ability to command particular control surfaces, potentially making the aircraft uncontrollable. The German pilot, demonstrating the survival instinct that transcended national allegiance and the training that emphasized preservation of experienced pilots, even at cost of aircraft, jettisoned his canopy and initiated bailout procedures at 27,000 feet. The bailout sequence, visible to Haydn for several seconds before his continuing maneuvers took him out of visual range, followed procedures drilled into all combat pilots. The pilot released his safety harness, ensuring he wouldn't be trapped in the aircraft during its uncontrolled descent. He rolled the aircraft inverted, or pushed into a dive to use gravity and aerodynamic forces to extract himself from the cockpit. Since the relative wind at high speeds made climbing out of an upright aircraft nearly impossible, once clear of the aircraft, he delayed parachute deployment initially to descend rapidly through altitudes where oxygen deprivation would cause unconsciousness within 30 to 60 seconds. At approximately 15,000 feet, where atmospheric oxygen concentrations supported consciousness, he deployed his parachute for the remaining descent to ground level. The parachute deployment sequence represented one of combat aviation's recurring moments of humanity, penetrating the abstraction of aerial warfare. The enemy pilot transformed from threatening target to vulnerable human being, suspended beneath a canopy of silk, descending toward whatever fate awaited him upon landing. That fate depended on numerous factors beyond his control. If he landed in friendly territory, he would return to operations after medical evaluation. If he landed in Allied-controlled areas, he would spend the remainder of the war in prisoner-of-war camps, conditions varying from adequate to severe depending on camp administration and supply situations. If he landed in areas where civilians had endured years of Allied bombing, he might face mob violence before military. Authorities could take him into custody. The destruction of the German fighter and the subsequent scattering of his formation created a temporary spatial advantage for Haydn's element. Yet this advantage existed within a larger tactical reality. Scattered across the surrounding sky, additional German fighters were converging on the bomber formation from multiple vectors. Radio intercepts later revealed that Luftwaffe ground controllers were coordinating a multi-squadron engagement intended to overwhelm the escort fighters through numerical superiority at specific points in the formation. The German ground control system, while less sophisticated than would emerge in later decades, provided effective coordination of dispersed fighter forces through radio vectoring based on radar tracking of bomber formations. This represented the critical moment when tactical doctrine intersected with individual judgment. Haydn faced a decision matrix common to escort fighter operations. He could continue pursuing the scattered German formation, potentially achieving additional kills, but drawing his element away from the bomber stream and leaving gaps in protective coverage. He could return immediately to station above the bombers, maintaining protective positioning, but surrendering the immediate tactical advantage of having disrupted an enemy formation. Or he could assess the evolving tactical situation for opportunities that might not fit established doctrine but could provide advantages through unconventional action. Standard doctrine clearly specified immediate return to station. Fighter command directives emphasized that the primary mission was bomber protection, not accumulation of individual victory credits. Pilots who pursued personal glory at the expense of mission effectiveness faced censure regardless of their personal victory tallies. The campaign's strategic objective, establishing air superiority over Europe, required systematic attrition of German fighter forces while protecting bomber formations sufficiently to enable sustained strategic bombing operations. This strategic framework prioritized collective mission success over individual achievement, a value system deliberately cultivated through training and reinforced through operational evaluation criteria. Yet, effective combat pilots possessed judgment to recognize when tactical situations warranted deviation from standard procedures. This judgment represented one of the intangible qualities that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. It required confidence in personal assessment, willingness to accept responsibility for unconventional decisions, and ability to evaluate risk-reward ratios under extreme time pressure. The military tension between following orders and exercising initiative had characterized warfare throughout history. Successful military organizations cultivated cultures that balanced discipline with initiative, obedience with judgment, standardization with adaptation. It was during this moment of tactical reassessment that Haydn observed the phenomenon that would catalyze his improvised strategy. Approximately 2,000 feet below his position, a damaged Bf-109, apparently struck by bomber defensive fire during an earlier pass, was trailing smoke and descending in a gradual spiral. The aircraft remained under partial control, with its pilot presumably attempting to reach sufficient altitude to bail out safely or to glide toward German-held territory. The significance of this observation lay not in the damaged aircraft itself, but in its spatial relationship to other elements of the unfolding engagement. Haydn's tactical awareness, that continuously maintained mental model of aircraft positions, velocities, and probable intentions, indicated that additional German fighters were forming for another attack run approximately 3,000 feet above and 2 miles ahead of his current position. The damaged Bf-109's descent trajectory would take it through the altitude band, where those German fighters would be positioning for their attack. This geometric relationship sparked the tactical innovation that would define this engagement. Haydn recognized that the damaged German aircraft presented an opportunity for visual deception that might disrupt the forming attack. The concept required several assumptions. German pilots conducting visual identification at combat ranges would require several seconds to distinguish friend from foe when visual cues were ambiguous. The appearance of a damaged friendly aircraft in close proximity to what might be an attacking enemy fighter would create decision-making hesitation among German formation leaders. Any delay in German attack timing would provide advantage to the bomber formation and approaching escort reinforcements. These assumptions involved risk. Positioning himself near the damaged German aircraft would place Haydn in a predictable location, potentially making him easier to target. It would separate him from his wingman, reducing mutual support capability. It would commit him to a specific course of action that might prove ineffective or counterproductive. Yet the potential benefit justified these risks within Haydn's tactical calculus. The forming German attack, if executed without disruption, would likely penetrate bomber defenses and inflict significant casualties. Any degradation of that attack's timing or coordination would reduce its effectiveness. The unconventional nature of the maneuver might generate confusion disproportionate to the action's inherent threat. Haydn initiated the maneuver by transmitting a brief radio call to his wingman. "Cartwright, I'm going low after the damaged bogey. Maintain high cover." This communication served multiple purposes, informing his wingman of his intentions, establishing that Cartwright should maintain standard positioning above the bombers, and creating a radio record of his tactical decision. The execution required precise energy management and spatial positioning. Haydn initiated a descending spiral that matched the vertical rate of the damaged Bf-109, positioning his P-38 approximately 500 feet to the German aircraft's starboard side and slightly aft. This positioning was calculated to create specific visual effects. From the perspective of German fighters approaching from ahead and above, Haydn's P-38 would appear closely associated with their damaged comrade, potentially suggesting either an escort attempt by another German aircraft or an attack already in progress. The P-38's distinctive appearance, which under normal circumstances would immediately identify it as hostile, became ambiguous at extended ranges when positioned near another aircraft. The twin-boom configuration, while unmistakable in profile or when viewed from certain angles, created less characteristic silhouettes from other perspectives. At 2 miles distance, with both aircraft in motion and the visual field cluttered by other aircraft, clouds, and the continuous scanning required to maintain situational awareness, the precise identification process required several seconds of focused attention. The human visual system, optimized for ground-based existence, struggled with the unique demands of aerial combat identification. Depth perception beyond a few hundred yards became unreliable, forcing pilots to rely on size estimation, silhouette recognition, and motion patterns to identify aircraft types and assess threats. The cognitive load of simultaneously managing aircraft control, monitoring instruments, maintaining formation awareness, and scanning for threats meant that ambiguous visual information could generate hesitation, disproportionate to the actual ambiguity involved. The technical execution demanded continuous management of multiple aircraft systems. The Allison V1710 engines required careful attention during the descending spiral. Manifold pressure needed adjustment to prevent overboosting during the descent, where increasing atmospheric pressure at lower altitudes could cause excessive cylinder pressures if throttle settings remained unchanged. Engine mixture controls required enrichment to maintain optimal fuel-air ratios as ambient air density increased. Propeller pitch demanded modification to maintain appropriate RPM, preventing overspeeding that could damage reduction gears or cause propeller structural failure. Coolant temperatures needed monitoring to ensure cooling systems could dissipate the heat generated during sustained operation. Simultaneously, Hayden maintained visual contact with multiple reference points. The damaged German aircraft whose descent he was matching required continuous attention to maintain proper spacing and trajectory matching. The forming German fighter formation ahead and above demanded periodic scanning to assess their tactical development and timing. His wingman's position relative to the bomber stream needed verification to ensure Cartwright maintained appropriate defensive positioning. The bomber formation itself required awareness to maintain orientation relative to the primary mission objective. The broader airspace demanded scanning for additional threats that might emerge from unexpected vectors. This multi-point awareness represented one of combat flying's most demanding cognitive tasks. Psychological research, conducted during and after the war, identified that effective combat pilots demonstrated exceptional divided attention capability, the ability to rapidly shift focus among multiple information sources while maintaining accurate mental models of all critical elements. This capability correlated with survival rates more strongly than many technical flying skills, suggesting that situational awareness represented perhaps the most critical combat aviation competency. The descent continued for approximately 90 seconds, covering nearly 3,000 feet of altitude. During this interval, Hayden observed the approaching German fighter formation, now identified as a second wave of approximately 12 aircraft, alter their intercept vector. The formation leader's aircraft, distinguishable by its position at the formation's apex and occasionally by distinctive markings that experienced pilots used to enhance their visibility to subordinate pilots, appeared to adjust its flight path. The wingmen, maintaining formation discipline, mirrored this adjustment, creating a visible ripple effect through the formation as each pilot responded to the leader's maneuver. Post-mission intelligence analysis, correlated with German radio intercepts captured by Allied signals intelligence units monitoring Luftwaffe frequencies, suggested that the formation leader had indeed questioned the tactical situation upon observing what appeared to be two aircraft in close proximity, one trailing smoke. Intercepted radio communications included fragments suggesting confusion and uncertainty. The German language transmissions, when translated, included phrases questioning whether the aircraft were friendly, requests for position confirmation, and what appeared to be debate among formation members regarding the proper tactical response. The psychological dimension of this hesitation reflected fundamental aspects of combat decision-making under conditions of incomplete information and high consequence. German fighter pilots operating in defended airspace faced continuous assessment challenges that involved life or death decisions compressed into seconds. The cognitive load of managing aircraft control, navigating three-dimensional space, monitoring fuel and ammunition status, tracking multiple threats, and making tactical decisions created conditions where ambiguous information could generate decision paralysis, or at minimum create delays while additional information was gathered or processed. The apparent presence of a damaged friendly aircraft created a specific cognitive challenge. German fighter doctrine, like that of all effective air forces, emphasized mutual support and protection of disabled comrades when tactically feasible. The ethical and practical imperatives were intertwined. Ethically, abandoning comrades violated military culture and personal bonds among squadron members. Practically, experienced pilots represented irreplaceable assets whose preservation justified accepting some risk. The appearance of a second aircraft in close proximity to their damaged comrade triggered consideration of multiple possibilities. Was that aircraft providing escort protection? Did it represent the threat that had damaged their comrade? Was it an enemy fighter executing an attack that required immediate intervention? Or was it a friendly aircraft whose presence created fratricide risk if the formation attacked without proper identification? This hesitation measured in seconds rather than minutes, proved tactically significant within the compressed timeline of aerial combat. The delay in the German formation's attack sequence allowed the primary bomber stream to advance approximately 2 miles further along their planned route. At the bomber's indicated airspeed of 165 miles per hour, or approximately 242 feet per second, even a 30-second delay translated to over 7,000 feet of additional progress toward the target area. More significantly, the delay allowed additional P-47 Thunderbolt squadrons, operating at maximum cruise speed from their departure points, to close the distance to the bomber formation. The approaching P-47 squadrons represented the carefully orchestrated timing that characterized evolved escort doctrine. Different fighter types with varying fuel endurance characteristics and performance profiles were assigned to specific mission phases. P-47 Thunderbolts, with excellent high-altitude performance and robust construction but limited range compared to P-51 Mustangs, typically provided escort during intermediate mission phases. Their scheduled arrival at this point in the mission reflected planning calculations based on bomber navigation timing, expected German intercept patterns, and fuel consumption projections for the various fighter types. The temporal advantage created by Hayden's deception maneuver, while modest in absolute terms, became significant within this carefully synchronized operational choreography. The tactical situation evolved with the unpredictable dynamics characteristic of combat when multiple actors pursued independent objectives with incomplete information about others' intentions. The damaged Bf-109's pilot, apparently recognizing the P-38's presence and perhaps misinterpreting Hayden's intentions, attempted an emergency maneuver. Whether this reflected a desperate attempt to escape what he perceived as an imminent attack, a misunderstanding of Hayden's purpose in maintaining formation proximity, or simple loss of aircraft control due to progressive battle damage, remains unclear from surviving documentation. Combat situations rarely provided the luxury of understanding others' intentions or motivations, requiring participants to make decisions based on incomplete information and probabilistic assessments. The German pilot executed a sharp banking turn that, given his aircraft's damaged state and reduced controllability, resulted in an uncontrolled spin entry. The Bf-109 transitioned from gradual spiral descent to violent rotation around its vertical axis, with the nose dropping sharply and the aircraft accelerating in an unstable descent pattern. Spins represented one of aviation's most dangerous conditions, particularly in damaged aircraft at medium altitude. The aerodynamic forces involved in spinning, where one wing was stalled while the other maintained some lift, created rotational moments difficult to counter, even in undamaged aircraft with full control authority. Recovery required specific procedures, including opposite rudder application to stop rotation, forward control column movement to break the stall, and careful application of power and elevator to arrest the descent without entering a secondary stall. The probability of successful recovery depended on multiple factors. The pilot needed adequate altitude for recovery procedures to take effect before ground impact. The aircraft needed sufficient structural integrity and control surface authority to respond to recovery inputs. The pilot needed to maintain spatial orientation, despite the disorienting sensory inputs generated by rotation, and needed to execute proper recovery procedures despite the stress and time pressure of the situation. In this case, the damaged condition of the aircraft, the reduced altitude available for recovery, and the pilot's probable injuries or incapacitation from previous combat damage combined to create conditions where recovery appeared unlikely. This sudden maneuvering created cascading confusion among the approaching German fighters. From their perspective several miles away, the tactical situation had transformed from potentially ambiguous to clearly threatening. The damaged aircraft's violent maneuvering, combined with the close presence of another aircraft, suggested active engagement in progress. Radio intercept logs captured fragmented communications suggesting uncertainty and debate among German pilots regarding the proper tactical response. Some transmissions indicated pilots questioning whether their damaged comrade was under attack and required immediate assistance. Others suggested uncertainty about the identity of the second aircraft. Still others indicated formation leaders attempting to maintain tactical discipline while assessing the situation. Several factors contributed to this communication breakdown and tactical confusion. Experience disparity within the formation created differing interpretations of ambiguous situations. By March 1944, Luftwaffe fighter formations increasingly comprised mixed experience levels. Veteran pilots with hundreds of combat hours operated alongside recently trained replacements with minimal operational experience. This disparity created challenges for formation coordination. Experienced pilots might recognize tactical situations and appropriate responses that confused newer pilots, leading to divergent threat assessments within formations and potentially conflicting responses as different pilots pursued actions based on differing situational understanding. Communication limitations inherent in 1944 radio technology compounded these challenges. Radio communication in single-seat fighters involved continuous background static from atmospheric interference, intentional and unintentional interference from other transmissions on nearby frequencies, and the acoustic challenges of speaking clearly while managing high G-forces, oxygen masks, and the loud acoustic environment of single-seat fighters with minimal soundproofing. Critical communications might be missed entirely, misunderstood due to transmission quality, or rendered incomprehensible by technical limitations or environmental factors. The German practice of maintaining radio discipline to prevent Allied signals intelligence from tracking formations through radio emissions further limited communication, with pilots often reluctant to transmit, unless absolutely necessary. The tactical ambiguity of the situation exceeded the standard scenarios that pilots were trained to recognize and respond to instinctively. The specific situation, a damaged friendly aircraft in close proximity to what might be an enemy fighter exhibiting erratic maneuvering, didn't fit standard tactical patterns. German fighter training emphasized recognition of common tactical situations and practiced responses to them. Frontal attacks on bomber formations, defensive reactions to escort fighter bounces, mutual support procedures when comrades were engaged, and various other scenarios were rehearsed until responses became reflexive. Novel situations that didn't match trained patterns required conscious analysis and decision-making, introducing delays into response, cycles, and creating potential for confusion when different formation members reached different conclusions. Command authority within German fighter formations created vulnerability to disruption if formation leaders became uncertain or focused, a tension on assessing non-standard tactical situations. German tactical doctrine emphasized hierarchical command structures with clear chains of authority. Formation leaders bore responsibility for tactical decisions, with subordinate pilots expected to execute orders and maintain formation discipline. This structure provided efficiency and coordination when situations were clear and leadership decisions were prompt. However, it created vulnerability when leadership became uncertain, as subordinate pilots awaited direction rather than exercising independent initiative. The American tactical approach, by contrast, increasingly emphasized decentralized decision-making and individual pilot initiative within overall mission parameters, accepting some coordination, inefficiency in exchange for greater adaptability to unexpected situations. Haydn exploited this expanding confusion by initiating a climbing turn that positioned him between the German fighters and his retreating wingman. This maneuver served multiple purposes simultaneously. It re-established his energy advantage, converting the potential energy of his lower altitude back into kinetic energy through acceleration during the climb. It created geometric complexity for German attack planning, as his climbing turn changed spatial relationships continuously and unpredictably from the German formation's perspective. It signaled to nearby Allied aircraft that active engagement was occurring in this sector, potentially drawing additional escort fighters to the area, and it positioned him to cover his wingman's position should the German formation decide to attack, despite their apparent confusion. The P-38's excellent rate of roll, substantially superior to the Bf-109 at higher speeds due to hydraulically boosted ailerons, allowed Haydn to transition from descending spiral to climbing turn with minimal energy loss. The roll performance represented one area where the P-38 possessed clear advantages over German fighters. The Bf-109's relatively small, thin wings generated excellent performance in terms of speed and climb rate, but created high stick forces in high-speed flight that limited roll rate. The FW-190's heavier weight similarly constrained roll performance. The P-38's power-boosted controls reduced stick forces and enabled rapid roll inputs even at high airspeeds, providing tactical advantages in situations requiring rapid maneuvering. Transitions. The technical execution of this climbing turn required intimate understanding of the P-38's aerodynamic characteristics and energy management principles. Haydn needed to balance the climb angle against airspeed decay, maintaining sufficient speed to avoid approaching stall conditions while maximizing altitude gain. The turbochargers required careful management during the climb, adjusting wastegates to maintain proper manifold pressure as altitude increased. Engine temperatures demanded monitoring as the climb reduced cooling airflow. The turn itself needed coordination of aileron, rudder and elevator inputs to maintain coordinated flight without inducing adverse yaw or excessive side slip. That would increase drag and reduce climb performance. The German formation's response to this maneuvering revealed their tactical confusion and the degradation of formation, cohesion that confusion generated. Rather than executing a coordinated attack as their original positioning and numerical advantage should have enabled, the formation appeared to fragment. Some aircraft maintained their original course, apparently committed to attacking the bomber formation regardless of the unexpected tactical developments. Others appeared to follow their formation leader's altered course, responding to radio commands or visual cues, even as the tactical purpose of that course change remained unclear. Still others appeared to break formation entirely, individual pilots making independent decisions about whether to investigate the situation with the damaged aircraft, pursue Haydn's climbing P-38, or proceed with the planned bomber attack. This fragmentation represented tactical victory for Haydn, despite the absence of additional aircraft destroyed. A coordinated attack by 12 fighters against a bomber formation, properly executed, could inflict substantial casualties. The bomber's defensive firepower, while significant in aggregate, could be overwhelmed by attacks from multiple vectors simultaneously. Fighter escorts positioned to intercept attacks from one direction might be unable to respond effectively to simultaneous attacks from other directions. The timing of coordinated attacks was critical, with German tactics emphasizing simultaneous arrival at attack positions to maximize confusion among defenders and minimize the effectiveness of escort fighter responses. The fragmentation of the German formation eliminated this coordination advantage. Individual aircraft or small groups attacking without coordination allowed escort fighters to engage them sequentially rather than simultaneously. Bomber defensive fire could concentrate on each threat in turn rather than splitting among multiple simultaneous threats. The tactical mathematics shifted decisively in favor of the defenders when attacking forces lost cohesion and coordination. This principle had been demonstrated repeatedly throughout the air campaign over Europe, with German success rates correlating strongly with attack. Coordination while fragmented attacks rarely achieved significant results while suffering disproportionate losses. The broader tactical situation continued, evolving as additional forces entered the engagement area. The P-47 Thunderbolt squadrons that had been approaching during Haydn's deception maneuver arrived at approximately 09:20 hours, adding 16 additional fighters to the escort force in this sector. The Thunderbolt, officially designated P-47, represented Republic Aviation's contribution to American fighter development. It was the largest and heaviest single-engine fighter of the war, weighing over 17,000 pounds fully loaded, powered by a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800. Double Wasp radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. The P-47's design philosophy contrasted sharply with the P-38's approach. Rather than achieving performance through twin-engine configuration, the Thunderbolt extracted maximum capability from the most powerful single engine available, accepting the weight penalties of heavy armament, substantial fuel capacity, and robust construction. The result was an aircraft that could absorb tremendous battle damage and continue flying, possessed devastating firepower from 850 caliber machine guns, and demonstrated excellent high-altitude performance, where its turbocharged engine maintained power output. Its primary limitation was range, which, while adequate for many escort missions, fell short of the distances the P-51 Mustang could achieve. The arrival of these additional fighters fundamentally altered the engagement mathematics from the Luftwaffe perspective. German fighter tactics increasingly emphasized hit-and-run attacks designed to minimize exposure to escort fighters while maximizing damage to bomber formations. These tactics depended on achieving favorable local numerical superiority at specific points and times, overwhelming defenders through concentration of force. The arrival of reinforcements transformed what might have been a favorable engagement scenario into one requiring German pilots to weigh potential bomber kills against increased risk of being engaged by numerically superior escort forces. Radio intercepts captured the German formation leader ordering a tactical withdrawal. The decision reflected not cowardice, but calculated risk assessment based on changed tactical circumstances. Luftwaffe fighter squadrons faced the continuous challenge of balancing aggressive engagement against preservation of experienced pilots and irreplaceable aircraft. The loss calculus had shifted dramatically by 1944. While shooting down Allied bombers provided immediate tactical benefit and contributed to the defense of German territory and industry, the loss of experienced fighter pilots created strategic vulnerabilities that no amount of aircraft production could compensate for. German pilot training programs had been progressively degraded throughout 1943 and into 1944 due to fuel shortages, instructor losses, and compressed training schedules driven by operational demands. New pilots arrived at operational squadrons with substantially less training than their predecessors from earlier war years. Where pilots in 1940 and 1941 might have accumulated 200 or more flight hours before operational assignment, by 1944, many replacement pilots arrived with fewer than 100 hours total flight time. These inexperienced pilots required protection and mentoring from veterans to survive long enough to develop combat effectiveness. The loss of veterans therefore created compounding effects, reducing not only immediate combat capability, but also degrading the squadron's ability to transform new pilots into effective combatants. The German formation's withdrawal proceeded in relatively good order, despite the earlier fragmentation. The formation leader's radio command apparently re-established cohesion sufficiently for an organized retirement from the engagement area. The aircraft that had maintained formation discipline throughout the confused engagement quickly reformed on their leader. Those that had broken formation or pursued individual initiatives took longer to rejoin, but eventually re-established formation integrity. The withdrawal trajectory took them away from the bomber stream and deeper into German-controlled airspace, where they could disengage with reduced risk of pursuit by Allied fighters constrained by fuel, limitations and responsibilities to maintain bomber protection. Haydn observed this withdrawal while climbing back toward his assigned station. Above the bomber formation, the engagement had consumed approximately 8 minutes from initial contact to German withdrawal, a duration representing extended combat by the standards of air warfare, where most engagements lasted less than 5 minutes. During those 8 minutes, the bomber formation had continued advancing toward its target, maintaining course and altitude with the mechanical precision that characterized well-trained bombardment units. The bombers' crews had been aware of the engagement occurring in their vicinity, monitoring radio communications and observing distant aircraft maneuvering, but had maintained their assigned positions and continued their mission profile. This dedication to mission continuation despite nearby combat exemplified the bomber crew's psychological conditioning and professional discipline. The men flying those bombers, typically 10-man crews in each B-17, understood that their survival depended substantially on maintaining formation integrity. Breaking formation, whether from fear, confusion, or misguided initiative, made an aircraft vulnerable to concentrated attack and reduced the formation's overall defensive capability. The training and culture of bomber units emphasized formation discipline above almost all other considerations, with commanders preferring to see damaged aircraft struggle to maintain position rather than leaving formation and exposing themselves to isolated attack. The post-engagement assessment began even before Haydn returned to his assigned position. Radio communications among escort fighters included brief situation reports updating force composition, fuel states, ammunition expenditure, and observed damage to friendly and enemy aircraft. These communications provided operational commanders with real-time awareness of engagement outcomes and resource status, informing decisions about reallocation of forces, timing adjustments, or contingency activations. The professionalization of air operations by 1944 meant that even during active combat, information flowed through established channels to enable command decisions based on current, rather than outdated situation assessments. Haydn's fuel state, while adequate for mission completion, reflected the consumption associated with combat maneuvering. High-power settings during the climbing turns and descending spirals had consumed fuel at substantially higher rates than cruise flight. The P-38's fuel management system, while sophisticated for its era, required pilot attention to balance fuel consumption between various tanks to maintain proper aircraft trim and ensure fuel feed to engines. Haydn verified his fuel quantity, confirmed acceptable levels for mission continuation, and adjusted his power settings to optimize endurance for the remaining mission phases. The ammunition expenditure from his brief engagement with the B-109 he had destroyed left him with substantial remaining firepower. The 50 caliber machine guns retained approximately 120 rounds total, while the 20mm cannon retained 127 rounds. These quantities provided capability for several additional engagements, though ammunition conservation remained a consideration for extended missions. Pilots who exhausted ammunition early in missions found themselves effectively disarmed for remaining mission phases, able to maintain formation presence but unable to engage threats. The balance between aggressive engagement and ammunition conservation represented another continuous judgment challenge for escort pilots. The bomber formation reached the target area near Brunswick at approximately 10:35 hours, having navigated through scattered German fighter attacks and moderate flak concentrations without suffering catastrophic losses. The bombardment sequence proceeded according to established procedures, with lead bombardiers in each group identifying aim points through their Norden bomb sites and releasing ordnance at calculated moments. Trailing aircraft in each formation released on visual cues from lead aircraft, creating carpet bombing patterns designed to saturate target areas with high explosive and incendiary munitions. The industrial complex targeted that day sustained substantial damage according to post-strike reconnaissance imagery. Multiple buildings showed structural collapse or extensive fire damage. Rail lines serving the complex exhibited cratering and distortion, requiring extensive repair before resuming operations. The cumulative effect of such attacks, repeated against multiple targets across German industrial capacity, progressively degraded production output and diverted resources to repair and reconstruction rather than expansion or innovation. The strategic bombing campaign's success metrics extended beyond immediate destruction to encompass sustained production, disruption and resource diversion. The return flight proceeded with decreasing German fighter activity as the formation withdrew westward. Luftwaffe fighter units, having expended fuel and ammunition in earlier engagement attempts, had largely returned to their bases for refueling and rearming. This pattern characterized most bomber missions, with German intercept intensity highest during bomber penetration phases and decreasing during withdrawal phases. The tactical calculation involved concentrating available forces to achieve maximum effect rather than dispersing them across the entire mission profile, where their impact would be diluted. The bomber formation recrossed the English Channel at approximately 12:10 hours, transitioning from hostile to friendly airspace with the psychological relief that accompanied survival of another mission. Aircraft with battle damage or mechanical issues began declaring emergencies and requesting priority landing clearances. The systematic processing of returning aircraft, directing them to appropriate airfields based on damage state, fuel remaining, and injured crew status, reflected the operational sophistication that enabled sustained campaign operations. Ground support infrastructure at English bases included medical facilities, maintenance capabilities, and operational debriefing teams prepared to receive and process hundreds of returning aircraft and thousands of aircrew within compressed timeframes. Hayden landed at RAF Honington at 12:47 hours, having completed a mission lasting exactly 7 hours. The landing sequence followed standard procedures, with tower controllers sequencing arriving aircraft based on fuel state, damage, and pilot experience. Hayden's landing, smooth and precisely executed despite accumulated fatigue from 7 hours of high-altitude flight and combat stress, reflected his training and experience. The P-38's tricycle landing gear made landing easier than conventional tailwheel fighters, eliminating ground handling challenges that claimed numerous aircraft and pilots throughout the war. Post-flight inspection of his aircraft revealed minor battle damage from the engagement. Several small-caliber hits had penetrated the left boom's aft section, apparently from defensive fire from the Bf-109 he had engaged, or possibly from another German aircraft during the confused maneuvering that followed. None of the hits had struck critical systems, and the aircraft remained fully mission-capable after routine repairs. This represented fortunate outcome, as battle damage frequently rendered aircraft temporarily or permanently non-operational, requiring extensive maintenance or complete replacement. The debriefing process began approximately 30 minutes after landing, allowing pilots time to use facilities, obtain refreshments, and begin psychological decompression from combat operations. Intelligence officers interviewed each pilot individually, recording observations, engagement sequences, ammunition expenditure, observed enemy tactics, and tactical recommendations. These debriefings served dual purposes of immediate operational intelligence for mission planning and long-term tactical doctrine development. The systematic capture and analysis of combat experience represented one of the American military's significant advantages, enabling rapid identification and dissemination of effective tactics while correcting unsuccessful approaches. Hayden's description of his deception maneuver generated substantial discussion among debriefing officers. The tactical concept, using an enemy aircraft as visual confusion element to disrupt attack timing and coordination, lacked precedent in documented engagement reports. Intelligence officers cross-referenced his account with radio intercept logs, gun camera footage from other aircraft in the engagement area, and radar tracking data when available to construct comprehensive timeline of the engagement sequence. The correlation of multiple information sources provided verification of pilot accounts and enabled reconstruction of engagement dynamics from multiple perspectives. The analysis revealed several factors that had contributed to the tactic's effectiveness. Visual identification challenges at combat engagement distances could be exploited under specific circumstances to create tactical confusion. German formations demonstrated vulnerability to ambiguous situations that generated decision-making hesitation among formation leaders. The temporal advantage created by delaying enemy attacks, even briefly, could provide strategically significant benefits within compressed engagement timelines. Individual pilot initiative and willingness to deviate from standard procedures when circumstances warranted could generate tactical advantages, unavailable through rigid adherence to doctrine. Intelligence assessments concluded that while the specific circumstances enabling Hayden's tactic were unlikely to recur frequently, the underlying principles merited inclusion in tactical training curricula. Training should emphasize cognitive frameworks enabling recognition of spatial relationships, assessment of enemy decision-making processes, and evaluation of risk-reward calculations for unconventional approaches. The goal was cultivating pilots capable of recognizing and exploiting unexpected tactical opportunities rather than attempting to replicate specific maneuvers. The broader mission assessment determined that the operation had achieved its primary objectives with acceptable losses. 4 bombers had been destroyed by enemy action, with 2 additional aircraft so severely damaged they were written off after return to base. Loss rate of approximately 3.3% fell substantially below average for penetration missions to comparable distances. Intelligence attributed the relatively low losses to effective escort fighter, performance throughout mission profile, and fortunate weather. Conditions that permitted accurate navigation while providing some tactical concealment through scattered clouds. Human engagement. Outcomes included 3 escort fighters lost with 2 pilots killed and 1 captured after bailout over enemy territory. Enemy losses were estimated at 9 aircraft definitely destroyed and 4 probably destroyed based on pilot claims, gun camera evidence, and correlation with intelligence sources. The kill-to-loss ratio of approximately 3:1 represented favorable outcome by 1944 standards, though substantially lower than ratios achieved during 1942 and early 1943, when Allied technological and tactical advantages had been more pronounced. Hayden's personal victory credit. The Bf-109 destroyed during the initial engagement brought his total to 7 confirmed aerial victories. This placed him among the more successful pilots in his squadron, though well below the totals accumulated by top aces who had achieved 15 or more victories. The distribution of aerial victories among fighter pilots followed patterns that military psychologists found fascinating. A small percentage of pilots accounted for disproportionate numbers of victories, while substantial numbers of pilots completed entire combat tours without achieving any confirmed victories. This distribution reflected combinations of skill, opportunity, aggressiveness, and chance that created wide variations in individual outcomes. The tactical innovation Hayden had demonstrated received formal recognition through inclusion in classified tactical memoranda distributed to fighter groups throughout 8th Air Force. The memorandum, drafted by intelligence staff and reviewed by operational commanders, analyzed the engagement sequence and extracted principles applicable to broader tactical situations. Distribution through official channels ensured that lessons learned reached operational units where they could inform training and mission planning. This systematic approach to tactical innovation represented organizational capability that provided cumulative advantages over opponents less effective at identifying, analyzing, and disseminating combat lessons. The human dimension of combat service extended beyond tactical actions to encompass the accumulated psychological toll of sustained operations. Hayden, like all combat pilots, experienced stress effects that manifested in various ways. Sleep disruption became chronic, with pilots struggling to achieve restful sleep despite physical exhaustion. Anxiety symptoms emerged, ranging from subtle nervousness to acute stress reactions requiring medical intervention. Hypervigilance persisted even during ground operations, with pilots maintaining constant scanning behavior and reacting sharply to unexpected sounds or movements. The cumulative stress of repeated exposure to life-threatening situations created psychological burdens that no amount of training could fully prepare pilots to manage. The Army Air Forces recognized these effects and implemented policies intended to mitigate psychological casualties. Mandatory rest periods between missions provided recovery time. Rotation schedules limited total combat tour duration to 50 missions, after which pilots returned to training duties or other non-combat assignments. Psychiatric support, while limited compared to modern standards, provided intervention for pilots exhibiting severe stress symptoms. Recreation facilities at bases offered diversions from operational stress. These measures, while helpful, often proved inadequate to the scale of psychological challenges that sustained combat operations created. Hayden completed his combat tour in July 1944, having flown 53 missions over 7 months. His survival represented statistical anomaly. Casualty rates among fighter pilots varied substantially based on numerous factors, but overall figures suggested that pilots had approximately 60% probability of surviving 50 mission tours. The factors influencing survival included skill and training, aircraft reliability, tactical circumstances, and irreducible elements of chance. No pilot, regardless of skill, could eliminate risk entirely. Even the most experienced pilots operating the best aircraft under favorable tactical conditions faced probability of mechanical failure, unlucky enemy hits, or situational factors beyond their control resulting in death or capture. His transition from combat operations to training instruction followed typical pattern for experienced pilots. The military recognized that combat veterans possess knowledge and perspective invaluable for training replacement pilots. Hayden's assignment to operational training units allowed him to share tactical lessons with students preparing for combat deployment. The effectiveness of training improved substantially when instructors possessed recent combat experience and could contextualize technical instruction within operational reality. Students responded more receptively to instructors who had experienced what they would face, rather than instructors whose knowledge derived solely from manuals and second-hand accounts. The war's conclusion in 1945 transformed military aviation from existential necessity to peacetime profession, requiring dramatic adjustments. Hayden, like millions of other service members, faced the challenge of transitioning from military to civilian life. The GI Bill provided educational benefits that enabled veterans to pursue higher education or vocational training. Hayden attended Pennsylvania State University, studying mechanical engineering and completing his degree in 1949. His aviation experience and technical education led to career in aerospace industry, where he contributed to aircraft development programs throughout the Cold War era. His story, while notable for the specific tactical innovation of March 3, 1944, ultimately represented experience shared by thousands of pilots who served in combat operations over Europe. Individuals performed extraordinary actions within context of assigned duties, survived or died based on combinations of skill and chance, and carried experiences throughout their lives. The personal narratives of combat service, when examined closely, revealed human dimensions often obscured in strategic histories focusing on campaigns, operations, and statistical outcomes. The tactical innovation Hayden demonstrated endured beyond his individual service, through its incorporation into training doctrine and tactical thinking. Future generations of fighter pilots, studying combat history and tactical evolution, encountered his engagement as illustrative example of adaptive problem-solving under combat conditions. The principles extracted from his actions, exploiting visual identification challenges and formation decision dynamics, remained relevant even as technology evolved and specific tactics changed. The cognitive framework that enabled his innovation, recognizing spatial relationships and assessing opportunities for unconventional approaches, represented timeless aspects of effective tactical thinking, applicable across changing technological contexts. the P-38 Lightning that enabled his tactical innovations served throughout the war in various theaters, demonstrating particular effectiveness in Pacific operations, where its range and twin-engine reliability proved especially valuable. In European theater, it was progressively supplanted by P-51 Mustang as that aircraft's superior range and performance characteristics became available in sufficient quantities. The Lightning's legacy included not merely its combat record, but its contribution to aeronautical engineering knowledge and the tactical lessons learned through its operational employment. The broader narrative of strategic bombing campaign over Europe, within which Haydn's individual actions represented small element, achieved its objectives of degrading German industrial capacity and contributing to ultimate Allied victory. The campaign's effectiveness remained subject to historical debate, with scholars examining whether resources devoted to strategic bombing might have been more effectively employed in other ways. However, the campaign's contribution to victory through systematic destruction of German industrial infrastructure, transportation networks, and petroleum resources remained undeniable even as debates continued regarding optimization and alternative strategies. The human cost of this campaign proved staggering, with tens of thousands of Allied aircrew killed or captured and hundreds of thousands of German civilians killed in bombing raids. The moral complexities of strategic bombing, deliberately targeting industrial areas knowing that civilian casualties would result, troubled some participants during the war and generated extensive ethical examination afterward. The balance between military necessity and humanitarian consideration, between strategic effectiveness and moral constraint, represented tensions without easy resolution and continued informing debates about warfare ethics into subsequent decades. The story of one pilot's tactical innovation during one engagement on one day of the war ultimately provided window into larger themes characterizing that conflict and military aviation more broadly. Individual initiative within organizational frameworks, adaptation to unexpected circumstances, exploitation of enemy vulnerabilities, and the human experience of combat all emerged from examination of this specific incident. The geometry of survival in aerial combat, literal and metaphorical, required continuous calculation, adaptation, and occasionally inspired improvisation that transformed tactical situations through intelligent action at critical moments. Required continuous calculation, adaptation, and occasionally inspired improvisation that transformed tactical situations through intelligent action at critical moments.